to the CU Tri Show. It's a little bit different format today because Urbana Public TV was closed thanks to all the snow weather. And we also scheduled it for a little bit later. And so I'm Karen Sims with the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative, and I will have four wonderful guests with me. Just want to remind everybody that the views and the opinions of the guests are their own. So, they are free to speak however, and we're here to have a conversation about suicide in the Black community. There have been a number of things that have happened nationally and even locally around suicide. And Shandra actually was the person who suggested that we have this conversation. And after she initiated the conversation, several other people reached out. So I'm going to let my guests introduce themselves because, everybody has multiple titles. And so we'll use up half the time if I did the introduction. So who would like to go first?
I'll go ahead and go first. Okay. I'm Joe Omo-Osagie. I am, my full-time gig is a counselor at Parkland College. And I'm also the president of a mental health board and a couple of other things that I can't remember right now.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I just want to remind folks, questions are invited. So let's make this a conversation.
I am Shandra Summerville, and I work for the Champaign County Mental Health Board and Developmental Disabilities Boards. I am the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator for both boards. I am also a mother. I am an aunt. I'm a daughter and a great aunt as well, and also very passionate about the community that we call Champaign-Urbana, and also just privileged to be able to just be here in the space with all of you all having this important conversation about suicide.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm Dante Lotz, working for Urbana School District as a school social worker. I also do part-time work at the Well Experience, which is after-school programming, summer programming. I am a mentor as well as a SEL life coach over there. I also do some volunteer coaching / sponsoring with the First String Inc., which is currently in their basketball segment of the league. I am a father, 20-year-old son, Dontrell, and almost 4-year-old daughter, Imani. And I, too, am extremely passionate about my community. I don't allow people to talk reckless about it without offering some feedback on how we can get back to the community that they remember, we remember, a more healthier community. And I'm interested in this topic. Rarely get to talk about it, so we'll be having my ears open as well as speaking on it as well. Thank you.
Glad you're here. Hi, James. We're just doing introductions. Feel free. You're on.
Oh, hello, everybody. First off, good to see everybody. I have the pleasure of knowing every one of you and haven't had a chance to serve in this community along with each of you, and I'm honored to be here with you all. Just some background on me, James Warren. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I got my bachelor's in psychology from U of I, master's in social work from U of I, and have been in this Champaign-Urbana community since 2005, doing mental health in a variety of different settings. Right now, I work full-time with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and part-time providing mental health for student athletes at the University of Illinois. Why, I'm honored to be a part of this discussion. Number one, because suicide is something that causes harm. It causes harm for the individuals who are experiencing it themselves. It clearly causes harm for the individuals who suffer from the loss of individuals who die by suicide. And every single life is precious. Every single life is valuable. And so any opportunity we have to have discussions on how we can hopefully help people's quality of life be better, I am open to the discussion.
So once again, I really appreciate you all taking time out of your days to join this conversation. And remember, you can ask questions because we want to make this interactive. So why do you think both James and Dante and even Sandra, you said, hey, it's important to have this conversation? Why'd you say that? What do you think why is it important to have, and why is it an important conversation to have now?
I personally believe it's important because in some households it might be viewed as taboo, where again we don't just up jump and have these conversations on a regular basis. So to intentionally have it, my opinion, is one of the healthiest ways to deal with it. We know education can cure a lot of things, help shift paradigm of things, and so the more we can have discussions, even the same discussions, the better. Karen, that's just like when you do presentations at Urbana School District. I'm coming to your session every time. I don't care if it has the same title, because first of all, appreciate you, number one, but number two, you're going to pick up something different. You're going to retain more information the more you go to it. So repeating this conversation, there's nothing wrong with it. We need to have more of these conversations set up in different environments, different platforms, because you're going to reach different people. And again, it's just important for us to open up, especially us Black males, who we know, there's this stigma that we are strong, we are invulnerable. A lot of us do not go take care of ourselves. And so, of course, this falls along in that same category as far as, it doesn't happen to us when it really does. It just looks different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to what Dante said. A lot of times I encourage us to think about mental and emotional health the same way we think about physical health, right? And the reality is, if I have a stomach ache, and I'm feeling the fact that I have that stomach ache, but then I try to act like I'm not having it, it doesn't change the fact that it's still there. And so the topic of suicide is very real in all of our communities, and it's specifically very real in the Black community and in the communities of people of color. And us acting like it's not real, us acting like it's not there, much like with our physical health, if we recognize that there are things going on with our physical health and try to ignore it, eventually it's hard to ignore when it actually takes a toll on us physically. And unfortunately, when we talk about death by suicide, unfortunately, that's one of the only times we really talk about it is after someone has unfortunately taken their own life.
Yeah.
And so right now, having a conversation like this, we're being proactive and saying, number one, we know that this is a very real issue that real human beings in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our households are dealing with. So that we also know that there are resources out there. There's help, there's hope, there's all that stuff. So just like, again, with the medical concept, let's understand what's going on, and then let's have a conversation about, hey, because it's going on, let's talk about what we can do about it to try to address it and make it better.
Yeah.
So for me, what sparked my attention was the death of Regina King's son. I have a son that was kind of that age, and just kind of understanding and looking at how they kind of talked about their relationship publicly, and him doing the things that he was doing, but also when I say doing the things that he was doing, he was a DJ.
Yeah.
The DJs are the ones that keep the parties going. And knowing that the DJ is the one that's going to play the music to get everybody in a good mood, and to learn that this young man, music didn't save his life. when a whole lot of people actually believe music does save their life. Why didn't it save his? And so I like literally called Karen immediately and was like, can we just like talk about this? Can we just be honest? But also there is just some misunderstanding about suicide. The things that I have learned about suicide, it is a very private and personal decision that a person makes, that sometimes no one is privy to. And when someone does become privy to their decision to think about dying by suicide, I always have felt like it was an honor that someone has chosen me to just tell me that that they may need some support and need some help. And I also think that it's another conversation of how it impacts people who have even lived.
Uh-oh. We got Shandra like in suspended animation.
Okay.
We got you like, you got like cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Oh, where did I stop?
You said, you said you were talking about how privileged it feels sometimes to have people invite you into the conversation. And then the last thing that you said is something about deepening the conversation around living, and then we lost you.
Okay, so the people who have who are living, the people who have survived it, the family members who have actually survived it, and friends or family, however people choose to identify. I think that's another conversation, because oftentimes there is not support groups for those individuals, and there are also not support groups for people who have attempted to die by suicide and survived. That's another area that doesn't often have a lot of support.
Yeah, I did not start out wanting to be a part of a group of survivors. My brother ended his depression through suicide almost exactly 12 years ago. Prior to that, it was an academic for me. It was a vocational thing. I was part of a crisis team, from working with the Urbana School District to being with a mental health center, which is now Rosecrans. I was always on the crisis team and went out on calls when or with a crisis team and things like that. However, 12 years ago, it stopped being just vocational, just academic. It became personal. My brother, who had all the resources available to him, he had the wealth to afford any psychiatrist in town and could pay out of pocket, even without insurance, ended his depression through suicide. And it became something that I said, let's have a deeper conversation about this. Yeah. And anytime I have a student in my office who brings up the topic, anytime I have someone in the community who brings up the topic, it is not just something I want to talk about, it's something I want to get into and really find some solutions. Death by despair is something that we never seem to really want to talk about because we don't know how to categorize it. People are feeling a certain way and don't feel that there is an out. There's an easy out, and the only easy out is to end their lives. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about depression. We don't talk about it. Mental health is health. I mean, that's one thing I mention every time. Almost every time we start the mental health board meeting, that mental health is health. If you are diabetic, you get your diabetic medication. If you are struggling with mental health issues, you receive the help that you need and you want, and you find ways to deal with it. Before we got on air, I spoke about my mom who lives in town. And one of the things that we talk about, especially now that it's February and February 27th would make it 12 years exactly. My mom talks about my brother losing her son, her oldest boy, 12 years ago, and it hasn't ever left. For every suicide that is unfortunately successful, there are 20 to 40 people that are directly affected by it. And those are things that we don't seem to really take into consideration, that the survivors carry this burden with them. I mean, I remember on the day my brother ended his life, my family and I were on the way to his home, and we arrived maybe 30 minutes too late.
Yeah.
What would have happened if we arrived 45 minutes earlier? So and Gabriel knew he could always talk to me. I mean, Gabriel slept on the floor in my home while he was struggling with his depression. Although he had several apartment buildings and condominiums that he could stay at, he came to sleep on my floor because that was where he felt comfortable and he felt accepted. So it is a conversation we ought to keep having, because death by despair continues to happen.
Yeah.
And we need to find ways in which we broaden the conversation so that we all benefit from that conversation. And so we all might stop that next person from a death by despair.
Yeah. So thank you all for sharing. And clearly, this is a conversation that is really, really personal, right? It is not some abstract conversation. It pulls on all of our heartstrings. And I think I too was, when Shandra reached out to me to talk about this, like, I thought about how many people that I am knowing in my coaching business, who've got family members. I think about young folks who are local, who have had siblings and family die by suicide. And I realize like how infrequent we have these conversations. And I know I was thinking about this morning as a trauma survivor. I think I went through most of my 20s doing that, never intentionally thinking through a plan, but having that day-to-day thought, like I wasn't sure I wanted to live. And so I know that, and when I talk to people who are thinking about suicide and having suicidal ideations, I think that people miss that part. It is that day-to-day reflection. It is that having to decide every single day, sometimes multiple moments in a day, that it's worth it to keep going. And again, there's some despair that's like, I don't necessarily know I want to die, but I'm also not 100% sure about living. And that is hard. So I think so that being said, it is in the moment. Lots of people are impacted as something that we're talking about. But there used to be a myth, and I don't know if you guys remember this, that Black people had resiliency factors and we weren't impacted by suicide. What would we say to that? Because there was this idea that we didn't have to talk about it because it wasn't our issue.
So it's interesting. Oftentimes, and even though and I'll even admit this, is that when I hear an African American that has died by suicide, my first thought might be, was someone after them? Or did they try to were they trying to save themselves, and then just went ahead and just took their lives in order to, not just necessarily thinking that they were sad, and death, as Joe stated, death by despair.
Mm-hmm.
And so I oftentimes have to check myself, because that is a stigma, especially with a person who is thriving, that is showing love, knows that they are loved, and knows that there are people around, like in your situation, Joe, that you spoke about, was someone after them? It's oftentimes not to think about it. And so this has also prompted me, just being in the mental health field, has prompted me to just think differently about that. Not that someone is intentionally trying to kill, because Black people don't kill themselves.
So I want to say, right, like all of the data suggests that, unfortunately, although statistically we used to be really, really underrepresented in the data, we've been on a trend. First, we started off with looking at suicide among young Black boys, right? That was the first data point that started to change, where young Black boys under the age of 13 were dying at, astronomical rates, right, disproportionate. And then when COVID hit, we've also got an increase in suicide among Black and Latinx boys and women across every single age group. Why do you think that is? And then I probably have another question, so just know I'm going to ask you about the connection to gun violence. But why do you think we might be having an increase in suicide that's correlated with the COVID epidemic or pandemic?
I'll jump in here. I mean, that's something I've been thinking about over the last 2 years. I think part of what is happening is that the socioeconomic system itself we are seeing that our system isn't fair to people who do not have resources. And without resources, it has taken a larger impact on communities of color, communities that do not have the socioeconomic ability to isolate. If you are sick, you can't isolate in a 2-bedroom apartment if you have 4 people living there. There is no isolation. So all 4 of you will get it. And those kinds of economic issues are not things that we want to talk about, because it is easier to blame rather than to try to solve the larger problems. COVID exposed America's wound that was covered over, and it's filled with pus. And that's what we're not dealing with. It links into the gun violence, because the despair that we're feeling, and the loss of jobs, and the loss of self, and the loss of community, because you're isolated and you're not reaching out. And there's also the discomfort with the medical system. All those things have come into play. And in communities of color, it's been heightened because of our lack of trust of a larger system itself. And so because of all those things, suicide has become a choice that people make, because say, I am tired of being here and I don't see myself getting anywhere else, financially, socially, economically, psychologically, spiritually. You feel stuck. And because you're stuck, there's a sense that what else is there to lose? And unfortunately, suicide becomes the nearest option, because drug and alcohol death is a slow death. Overdose is not a slow death, but it's a death that can be prevented also. And those are things that we've seen that have also been heightened in every community. And it's also heightened in our community.
Yes.
So we have to look at all these different factors that's coming together. It's a crescendo. I mean, and if it's this music, we are really climaxing here and it's exploding.
Yeah.
Karen, I don't think you guys need me, because everybody is saying what I'm thinking.
Well, you can remember, repetition is the key. So,
That's why when I was trying to hurry up and jump in first, because I knew this would happen. But you guys are hitting it on all cylinders. Even with the next segment, whenever it come up as far as the connection with the gun violence, well, I'm not even going to speak on that. But yes,
go ahead. You can jump in. Go ahead. I gave you a preview. Go ahead, please. Jump in the water.
Let me say this first. In speaking on myself, I feel like I'm the most coolest person in the room most times. I'm the most laid back. I can sit back and observe, or I can be the life of the party. But I will say, when the pandemic hit and we were working remotely, I felt depression. I don't know if I've ever felt depression like I did during that time. I was really struggling, and it was impacting my work ethics. It was impacting. I try not to let it impact me as being a father, but it did have its impacts to where I had to be creative. But not only that, I have learned through the years not to keep those things to myself. And so I was openly sharing with, my colleagues, the principal, my support system. That wasn't something I was hiding, and it was important to me that I modeled what I typically would encourage those that I'm working with to do, and that is to connect with the people that you care about and they care about you. And so I did that, and for the most part, I received support. On that. On other ends, it was like, well, oh well, we still got a job to do, this and that. But end up coming through it, and I think that built me up as far as just helping me be more empathetic moving forward to those that say, hey, I'm struggling, or suicide is more than, as I was reading some of the highlights of the myth and facts, is more to saying, oh, you'll get over it, or you need to focus on being happy. It's not that easy, and that could be more damaging to the individual. So we truly have to meet each other where we're at. And again, I'm just blessed to have a supportive family. My mother, my sister, and other people in my family that are truly there. And the fact of that was the key thought that came to my mind before coming on here was, will this be connected to the gun violence? Because when I said it looks differently for us, it's not always the one stage depression and I'm going to come up with a plan, what have you. A lot of it is in our behavior, our risky behavior. And what we've been dealing with locally with over 250 shootings is the whole retaliation ordeal, where I've given up on myself, whether my buddy, my friend, family member has been murdered. And now I'm ready to go risk it all, not caring as far as that coming back on me. That to me is a form of suicide. Because with this small community, we don't have a lot of wiggle room with the activities that are happening, and that's why it's impacting us so much. Karen, if you recall, I know Shandra may have remembered the numbers as well. In like 2017-ish, 2018, these numbers was only like in the 70s or so. Going back then, and they had jumped a little higher prior to that. But we were manageable with the 70s, and still looking at how we can decrease that. And so for us to be at 250 plus is unbelievable for 2021. That's only 4 years, and so we have to find a way to reach those that need to be reached, not the ones that are okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's how do we build a relationship with the unreachable? I think it starts with the family dynamics, because we talk about the pandemic, we had family breakdown. You have people that were confined in those spaces, for long periods of time and told you can't come out. We're shutting down society, and you're gonna have to deal with it. And so when you are put in those spaces, things become different. Those that are receiving counseling, therapy and what have you. That changes drastically. It's a difference me connecting with you on a video versus being right there in person. So all of those dynamics has contributed to where we're at right now. And I often talk to my son Dontrell because that's his age group. Some of those kids that are involved in some of that, you know, were in Cub Scouts.
Yeah.
They were in first string. When you look at the bulletin for their funeral, you're seeing the first string pictures. You're seeing the scouting. You're seeing the church pictures. You're seeing them in these different spaces, but somewhere along the way, they devalued their life or feel as though there is no hope. Dontrell speaks on that often with me as far as Dad, I don't think we're going to be able to, and I have to keep on pushing on him. Yes, we can, man. We have to do it together. Yeah. Your age group is going to have to step up. We have to figure this out. I'm just showing him that I'm not giving up. I don't care what's going on, but we have to continue to connect with our young people and truly be there for them, to help guide them. All of them don't have the father figures that we may have had. My household didn't have the father figures. I had to get that from Boys and Girls Club early on. I had to get that from individuals like Chandra's dad when I got into middle school, high school. I had to get those examples. Sports. My mom made sure that I was involved in something and constantly connecting with people that looked like me and cared about me. And so I'm gonna shut it down so somebody else can get in there.
I think you said a lot of really powerful things. I am going to open it up, but one of my observations, and you guys, chime in, is that particularly with boys, but even to some degree with girls, we get to this point where we think certain people aren't salvageable anymore. So as soon as you get to be like in 7th grade, all of a sudden, and there's data that says this, is that we adultify Black children. And so you were involved in activities when you were younger and we thought we could save you. And then you get to be 7th grade. And then we think, well, if there's something going on, we as a community, and I'm going to say the collective we, start reflecting back that you're not valuable and you are disposable and we don't like you and we think you're criminal or aggressive or grown or, you name it. And I don't know how we change the mirrors that reflect back, but I just know like you go from cute and adorable and fixable to sort of disposable.
One of the things that has always, I've always wondered when I would see long lines at Rural King to purchase the new firearms, or long lines, where were the old firearms going? And I often, no one ever tells me where they go. And I often wonder, are those things either being refurbished into communities, but also, again, there is a culture of violence that we have in America that's often is not talked about, just in ways of how we even view protection, how we view protecting our families, how we view addressing conflict. And so children who have undeveloped minds are modeling this behavior because they're not thinking through a lot of different things. They're just modeling the culture of violence that they have seen. And so when we begin talking about suicide and gun violence, oftentimes in some communities in particular, I had heard about several gun suicides in rural areas that oftentimes weren't talked about. And I said, I wondered if this was considered gun violence too.
Yeah.
It is gun violence. And it is something that we don't talk about. I think the genesis of America is violence. When the Europeans came here from a feudal system where the feudal lords had been bastardizing the serfs for 1,000 years, they brought it to America and kept it going by doing it to the natives. And they brought enslaved our people and did it to us. And now we're doing it over and over in ways in which we are not willing to recognize that in order for us to get to a place where we all feel like we belong to the same community, we have to recognize that epigenetic violence that has been done to each other. Those are things that just keep coming back. We don't feel like we belong. I mean, I was just having a conversation with my 14-year-old today about what does it mean to belong. And in Black America, we don't believe that we actually belong to this society because this society hasn't really ever showed us that we belong. So we become disposable. Our deaths are not recognized as much as a death in a smaller community that is a predominantly white community. So we have to, how do we create a sense of belonging from birth till we're 100 years old? How do we keep that sense of belonging consistent rather than saying, hey, you disrupted and I don't like you any longer? We've got to create those restorative communities where you say, okay, you offended, but you know what? In order to be, we want you to still stay a part of our community. These are the things that we would like you to do to come back to being part of our community. Because the police isn't going to change it. Because the police is a representation of the violence that we see. The guns that we have more guns than we have people in this country. And those are things that we still represent consistently, the violence that we continue to perpetuate in a society. So what is it that will make us all feel like we belong to the same community, to the same country, to the same county, without feeling isolated?
Which is a powerful sentiment. And James, I want to bring you back into the conversation. And we're lucky that Kim Bryant, our local Rattle the Stars suicide expert, reminded us in the chat that over half of gun deaths are caused by suicide. So this question of gun access, we know, is correlated with suicide. So it's a bi-directional piece, and people talk about, and I know Kim talks about this, is death by cops, or people intentionally doing things that put themselves at risk because they're not right. Remember, it's that kind of passive, like, I'm not sure I'm going to have a plan, but if it happens, it happens. Risk behavior, because people don't feel like they can either be all they can be or that they're belonging. James, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. What would you have to add? And I know we should start shifting to solutions, but I want to get any feedback that you might have.
Yeah, it's interesting tying together different pieces of the conversation today. So one of the questions, the idea of some of the celebrity suicides and how that leads us to a conversation like this. Also the piece of children, and specifically children and people of color, their value being tied to, well, what can you do? How can you perform, whether it be as an athlete or a actress or, musician or something like that. And if you think about it, in a way that, in a sense, almost works against us, because when we see the report of some celebrity who dies by suicide, do we care because we actually see them as a human being?
Mm.
And so, as tragic as it is for that we know them because they're a celebrity, do we care just as much, about the person who literally lives down the block?
Yeah.
And the other piece of, again, when we have these conversations and they're based, and I'm not saying that that's what this conversation is, but when we have these conversations and they're based on headlines, the danger of that is, we as a community, as people, if we allow ourselves to care about things just because it's a headline, well, we all know how headlines work.
Mm-hmm.
Literally 10 minutes from now, there'll be a new headline about something else. And unless we actually start to care about it, because we care about the human beings around us, we care about the community around us, and care about everybody in the community around us. Any loss of life is tragic. Every life is precious. I just encourage all of us to make sure that when it comes to a topic like suicide, that we're not allowing ourselves to be reactive. But to Joe's point, and to everybody else's point, like really thinking about, like, these are very real things that people are experiencing. And again, part of what, and this sounds like this is where the conversation is about to shift, these are things that there are solutions to.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to start us off, James, or who would like to start? Because everyone said when we began this conversation, having the conversation needs to happen, and having the conversation over and over again. And I'm also acutely aware that I probably, and know other people who have had suicidal ideations, need to be honest about that, because the more we come out of the closet and begin to have these conversations around like what we did, what has worked, what didn't, the more we, not that we ever want to normalize it, but we can open up more. So we reduce some of the stigma, right, Shandra, around having these complex conversations. So what kind of solutions should we offer to, we can think about all the various levels. So sort of caregivers and friends, and then to individuals, and then we'll think about like stakeholders and people who are coming up with programs and services.
So if I could, I'll actually start with that one. So for myself, as a mental health professional, I joke with my different colleagues about, the things that they teach us in school, and, the vignettes that we do. Every time you run into a real life situation that you're like, man, they didn't teach us this in school, right? This wasn't in the textbook. But one of the things that has consistently been taught to me is the idea that for us in the mental health field, and I think for human beings, period, and this is even for me now, and I've seen it work, but I still have to remind myself, like, this works. The idea of actually speaking with people about suicide is a good thing.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable, yes. It may be awkward, yes. But ask the question. Yeah. What thoughts have you had about hurting yourself? What are you thinking? And the misconception is that if you ask somebody a question like that and they're not actually thinking about hurting themselves, well, somehow by you asking the question, that's going to cause them to be like, oh, I guess I didn't think about that, so maybe I should. It doesn't work like that. Okay. So one of the first things is, in any of the circles that we're in, when we're dealing with other human beings, if we're seeing things, if we're hearing things, if we're not seeing things, if we're not hearing things, if the person who normally comes in and says, hey, how are you doing? All of a sudden they just come in with the head down and go straight to their desk, go check on them. But again, specifically for the topic of suicide, asking someone, are you having thoughts about harming yourself? Asking those questions is one of the best resources we can have. And again, it might be uncomfortable for you to ask the question, it might be uncomfortable for the person to have the question asked, but worst case scenario, if we don't ask, and God forbid the person does do something to harm themselves, that's going to be uncomfortable for everybody as well.
I love that reflection. And don't just assume just because they've got a therapist or a counselor that they've had that conversation there. Because that's the other misnomer, is we're like, well, we don't have to bring it up because they got somebody who's fixing it. And that is sometimes just really not true. Anybody else want to talk about solutions? You're muted.
Okay, go ahead, Shandra.
I want to bring up a solution that Dante had talked about earlier, just about how it looks like or what it looks like. Actually looking at the signs and symptoms and knowing that they would actually look different culturally. They honestly might look very different. For a provider of a home, they may be working really hard, making money, and just so that they can. I want to provide. I think it's also important that we solutions to it is not just thinking that they are isolated and in their home, not talking to anyone, but it actually can look like they are doing it very out loud. So actually knowing signs and symptoms, but also being culturally responsive to them.
And so I think one of the things that I would co-sign on is that sometimes it's anxiety or feelings of constant overwhelm. It's not always depression. It could be like, and I think, Joe, you were talking about this. It's I just can't manage all of the contending responsibilities and demands and expectations over and over again, and not feeling well. Like it's a constant feeling of unwellness.
I mean, and we live in a society where we are seen as the other. So a lot of the statistics that we look at sometimes don't even reflect our pain. And so those are things that we have to take into consideration as we teach skills to people who can and who want to listen, because we have to, our churches and our schools and our social organizations ought to be having these conversations, not just in a mental health. I mean, we sponsor the mental health first aid. It's part of our conversation. Start having the conversation on so many different levels, not when they're 10 or 11, but when they're younger. What does it feel like to feel a sense of overwhelm? What does it feel like to have anxiety? And it would look different for everyone. Yeah. And just being aware or teaching someone to be aware of that creates kind of almost a normalcy to be able to have that conversation. Because part of what we're not having is a conversation. Yeah. We're uncomfortable about that conversation. Just like conversations about sex and sexuality. We don't want to talk about that stuff. And guess what? People are having sex and getting pregnant, and all those things are still happening because of the fear of, if I talk about it, something's going to happen. It will happen even if you don't talk about it, but creating an environment where it is normal to say, I am overwhelmed, I am anxious, I am angry. Because also as men, we are not given the chance to have this whole spectrum of emotions. Yeah. I can be angry and say, okay, yeah, he's an angry black man. That's okay. But if I start to cry, people get kind of freaked out. If I show all the kinds of, if I get too exuberant, they might say, oh, let's get a little, pipe it down. So we've got to give everybody the opportunity to have the full spectrum of their emotions and have everybody have their ears open to have this conversation. And it's a back and forth. It's not just a one-dimensional conversation where I am speaking and you listening. Let's go back and forth and have this conversation everywhere. Churches, schools, synagogues, mosques, wherever. Let's talk about it.
Love it. And I know Shandra said to me when we were gonna get ready, we're both all people of faith, and right. And she was like, but just to say, go back and pray about it probably isn't going to, is not the fix. And you can, that was part of the belief was that people of color had strong faith traditions, and somehow that made us, immune to suicide, that inoculated us from suicide. And we just know, again, I recently heard of a 70-year-old woman who was definitely grounded in her faith, who died by suicide. So across the age and spectrum. Dante, what would you like to add?
I have two thoughts come to mind. First one is we have to do a better job of helping identify those adult family members that influence our young people, have the greatest impact on our young people. When I think about uh, our young folks that were involved in traditional gangs, there was at least, even though, gangs looked at as being negative, there was at least an adult that I can go to. If I had an issue with a group of kids or a kid, I can go to this adult that could be a chief, a vice lord, over the gangster disciple, whatever connection there was, and have a conversation, be like, hey, we got this going on. I need your help. They would come help because they did believe in keeping our young people straight and education and making sure that they were doing what they're supposed to, regardless of their affiliation. So we have to find a way to connect to those healthy relationships. But it's a challenge because our kids are involved in cliques now. There is no hierarchy, nobody they're reporting to. And so that's why they're just nilly-willy doing whatever they want to do. So that's one piece. The other piece that I was reminded of came from Dontrell. Again, we're having these conversations. I'm trying to get in tune with our young folks as much as possible. But he brought up the fact that there's so many like that. There's so many kids you wouldn't believe using illicit drugs. I'm talking about beyond marijuana and alcohol, like the illicit drugs, the same ones. Entertainers, somebody brought that up earlier. Entertainers are glorifying music. The media is being glorified, and these young people are gravitating to that, thinking that's the life. And I think that's influencing some of their decision making. It might not be everything, but those are two things that came up. And the last one would be at Parenting with Love and Limits, we would call that unhealed wounds, traumas. We're dealing with the symptoms, the leaves and the branches. We're not going to the roots to deal with our situations, and we got to find a way to dig deep and get in tune with those different seeds.
So I loved all of those reflections. So it sounds like having the conversations, looking at root causes, making sure that there are trusted adults in all of our lives. You talked a lot about young people, but I know across the board, I mean, that whole issue of social isolation where you could be surrounded by people but not connected to people, right? There's a difference. And so making sure that we really promote good, authentic conversations, and also looking at drugs. And I know, Joe, you mentioned this too. Like you were like, some of what looks like just overdose or drug abuse could also be, passive forms of suicide. And so we just need to be having those full conversations because we know peers and substances make decision making far more complicated, right? You're more likely to do something rash and not good. Any closing thoughts? Because this has been a great conversation. I know you're all wishing to continue to have this conversation. We'll make sure that this is available on the CU Try Facebook page so that you can share it with people. But are there closing thoughts and words before we wrap up? And I also want to do a pitch. If you want more information about suicide or suicide awareness, Kim Bryant with Rattle the Stars is just a phenomenal resource in the community. So now I'm going to turn it back over to you. Any closing thoughts?
My closing thought would be for us to continue doing what we can as individuals, but also to try to work as a collective. I'm not gifted in all areas. I need to know my role and stay in my lane and be a part of the team. So that's just my thought right there.
Thank you. So reach out for help. Collaboration matters. I love it. Anybody else?
I think that also daily interactions also matter. as well, believe it or not. Just actually asking someone if you've noticed that they may look like they've been crying or something. I'm always asking people, are you okay?
Yeah.
And then they'll say no. And then it's a conversation. But I've also tried to make sure that I was available if they say they're not okay, to know what I can do to provide that initial support. Knowing the suicide prevention line, the national hotline, having those phone numbers in my phone, and just actually just listening to their story without judgment is something that I can do and just show up day to day. That doesn't cost anything. It doesn't require a meeting. It requires just me willing to be present and just asking someone that level of empathy, and just if they are okay.
Love that. So that's great advice. Anybody else have anything else to add? James, Joe?
Well, I mean, main thing, no judgment. I mean, no judgment. Just listen. Be authentic in your listening. Be real. I mean, learn to ask the questions. The mental health first aid is available. I mean, Parkland has it. I think the mental health board doesn't sponsor it as much any longer, but it is available. It is available online. It's available in lots of other places. If your place of work doesn't have it, your church can sponsor it. Your Boys and Girls Club can sponsor it. Peers work well with each other. You're much more likely to speak to a peer than to go to a professional sometimes. So sometimes we still have these resources right amongst people that we already know. So if we all learn the basic skills to just really listen to one another and talk to one another, that could alleviate some of it. I know my brother knew lots of people, but he had nobody he felt close to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why he slept on my floor.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say, just the idea of hope. So for those who are out there struggling with life, whatever part of life it is, that might have an individual who is considering harming themselves, taking their life, that piece of knowing that there is hope. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. You might not be able to figure it out by yourself. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. So just the idea of reaching out to somebody and saying something. Again, there's professionals out there. If you don't want to talk to a professional, pull a friend over, pull a family member over, something like that. And also in that, when you're willing to reach out to get the help, part of it is realizing that the idea of getting the help is so that you don't have to bear that burden by yourself.
Yeah.
So it's not a thing where it's like, okay, if you're contemplating hurting yourself or contemplating taking your life, well, you got to figure it all out and get out. It's like, no, it's like all we're saying is say something to somebody. There's a thing that I tell a lot of the clients that I work with, and a lot of people have heard this phrase, it's okay to not be okay.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
What I then followed up with is, but it's not okay to not say something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. So thank you all so much. I will put resources on the follow-up to this chat so that you can, as Shandra recommended, the suicide hotline and helpline. I love if you see something, say something. And if you're feeling something, it is okay to ask for help. I think that is going to be our collective invitation. And also remember, all of the issues matter. So how we treat each other, how we see each other, what supports we provide or don't provide, make a difference in the health and wellness of our community. And when people are vulnerable and they feel like no one cares and is available, we bear the scars. So we're all in this together. And thank you all so much for making time on this, snowy Friday to join us for this really important conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you.